Hi, Roy here on my channel. Roy reads anything, including the trashy reads of Garbaugust, reading event devised by Criminally. Details down below. And that event includes a bingo card, which I've been trying to complete, and that's led me to read various things to tick off squares. And it occurred to me that this latest batch I'm going to talk about, they all kind of key into different stages of life, you know. So it's a little bit like my life in pulp. So
it's like Shakespeare's Seven Ages.
it is like exactly like the Seven Ages of man in Shakespeare.
Man.
So one thing I read was a comic book collection called Infinite Crisis, which is, as it says, is subtitled "Fight for the Multiverse."
Why do we have to?
Multiverse, yeah, well, exactly. Multiverse has become pretty much a kind of such an accepted part of just about any work of fiction that it's actually become a bit old hat. I like to think that I'm as old as the multiverse because in 1961 in DC Comics a landmark issue appeared of The Flash called Flash of Two Worlds, where the current Flash superhero met the sort of original World War II era version of himself, who's a different person, different story, different costume, different name, etc. But the idea is they come from different dimensions and that there's travel possible between those two dimensions. And then that got fleshed out later on into all the superheroes, like the Justice League of America, for instance, meeting their different counterparts, and then other worlds were invented as well. So it all became a thing. The first American comic I read was a Justice League one called The Peril of the Paired Planets, which was one of these mega crossovers with a brain-bending story where the baddie wants to crush two Earths together to release a load of energy.
Of course he does.
So that was always been amazing. And then when I was a young man in the mid 80s, there'd been quite a lot of these crossovers by then, and there were multiple Earths of all kinds. It was all supposedly getting a bit unwieldy. So DC did a big event that involved all of their comic books called Crisis on Infinite Earths, where the idea is that all of these multiple realities are under threat, and included every character in the DC universe through time and space. So it was a big thing, and characters were dying, and it was, you know, I was really invested in that. They loved the idea of those company-wide events so much that more and more crises followed, which I've read but without the same level of engagement. And in various ways the multiverse has been reconfigured and rebooted and so on. And Infinite Crisis was one of those, but this is Infinite Crisis inspired by the hit video game. So comic books become video game, become comic books again. So that's what this is. It's the first of first collection of a whole series, and this one's written by Dan Abnett, who I really like as a writer. So yes, so this idea of the multiple Earths has been around, you know, as long as I can remember. As for this actual book, so I read this because inspired by video game, or based on video game, is one of the Garbaugust bingo squares, and I actually thought this would be a quicker read than the Arkham Knight book I've got, which actually looks pretty good. Now, did I enjoy it? Well, I enjoyed it to an extent. There's an inventiveness to coming up with the different worlds. So there's like a gaslit Earth that's a sort of steampunk kind of world. That's pretty cool. And there's a sort of post-apocalyptic Earth, and they've all got different versions of the main sort of superheroes. Also, because this is I suppose it's out of the normal continuity, being based on a game. You can have, like, Batman, for instance, taken to another version of reality, and he's never seen anything like that before, and he's reacting to it, the way one would, with kind of shock and surprise and having to come to terms with it. Whereas the regular heroes, they've done that sort of stuff so much, it'd be like, oh, this again. And of course, as a reader, I'm a bit like, oh, this again. But it was kind of okay. It's, despite the great writing of Dan Abnett, there's an awful lot of big battles not too interested in. I don't think I'll be following it up. But I did enjoy rather more Vampirella Dark Powers, also written by Dan Abnett. That's from Dynamite Comics, so it's not one of the bigger companies that have been around since the middle of the 20th century. And I got that for the Sexy Vampires Square, because it features Vampirella. Vampirella, a character I know very little of, because I think she used to be published by Warren magazines, who published in sort of black and white magazine format, not in the Comics Code. And all I really remember was these covers and posters of paintings of Vampirella in various kind of puberty troubling outfits and poses. So in this Dark Powers thing, yes, there's a multiverse. Yes, there's heroes coming from all the different universes. But it's a lot more fun because they've got no baggage, and there's a real feel of like, oh, these are like cool characters being invented. And Vampirella it sounds like she's not a real vampire in the traditional sense. I think she might have some kind of science fictional origin that I haven't looked into. But she is, she does vampire type things, and her way of dealing with evil entities would be to eliminate them completely, the way a vampire would. Whereas the group of heroes she's with, who are some sort of outfit that's like defend the multiverse, they're a lot more goody-goody and kind of, they've got sort of values and charters and things like that. So she has to be restrained, and will she fit in with them? I love the way she's drawn, because there's a lot of witty dialogue. She's very wry. Her facial expression, sometimes she looks a bit like Wendy Malick, which is a good thing for a kind of ironical character. So there's a lot going on, and it proceeds into the next collection focuses on Red Sonia, another great character. So I guess I'm not anti-multiverse, but I do think it's been the bane of Marvel, and you can get tired of it.
I know I am.
But like I say, that was a thing that I've lived with in my life of reading, as are these Richard Allen books. So Richard Allen wrote originally a book called Skinhead, published by New English Library, which I remember being kind of passed around at school. It was this kind of illicit literature, it's going to be so shocking, as were the sort of Hell's Angel books as well of the time. Went on to write all sorts of sequels, and I read one of them, Knuckle Girls. So Knuckle Girls came out in 1977. Great cover on the original book. It's a long time since I've had the actual original books, but this is in a collection of 3. 1977. They did a punk rock one as well, with one of the worst covers ever. But I don't know. I never read it at the time. I'd kind of grown out of them, I suppose. But it's part of the cultural response to the whole sort of things that were happening in the mid-70s. I guess it belongs alongside the sort of just that kind of punk rock attack on normal society. As a book, I actually thought it was pretty good, and it kind of remembering really that James Moffat, who's the actual name of the writer, he could write, held back by lots of things, not least his deadlines and alcoholism. But the way it works is there's basically a young offender called Ina Muray, who's on remand, and there's a social worker who's got to interview her to make her report to the court when her case goes forward for this attack she's done on another youngster. So a lot of it, you could turn it into a play. A lot of it's basically a two-hander with the social worker interviewing Ina, who's initially like completely unforthcoming, but eventually starts telling her stories of her, basically a story of her life, really, sort of youth and sort of various kind of scrapes she's gotten into. And obviously she's a bit of an unreliable narrator. Is she just telling these stories to get cigarettes off the social worker? And you get stuff about the social worker's life outside of that scenario as well. So it's all of that's a pretty neat structure. It's very shocking. It's very I was talking about the dangerous women going back to like Penny Dreadful days. It's got all that kind of transgression. I mean, one thing about the Victorian Penny Dreadfuls, some of them, the things that really upset people is they had young villains in them, e.g. the Wild Boys of London, who never got any comeuppance. They weren't morality tales. They were just like, hey, they're doing bad things and kind of getting away with it. So this is a bit like that. There's no big redemption. There's no. It's almost so. Part of it is like, can the social workers bear to be supportive of someone that they're beginning to see is just completely psychopathic and irredeemable? So interesting and kind of alarming, because other stuff I've read, like, I don't know, the Baroness pulp novel. Who cares about the sex and violence of baronesses? Or barons, I suppose, might do, but outside of the fantasy world, stuff that's like, it was in the headlines then, it's in the headlines now, like knife crime. It's just genuinely sort of can be sort of upsetting. Sort of working in the same world, not really a trashy read, more of a as it were, a proper book, but that is referencing that kind of stuff. It's actually got Clockwork Orange, Skinhead Girls, and the original Skinhead book, together with other stuff in this brilliant photo on the back. So it's sort of summoning up the time. So it's set in 1980. I think this is written like a couple of years ago by Steve Piper. Feathers by Steve Piper, published by Old Dog Books. So an indie published book about, what is it about? It's about a young woman who we first meet escaping from a care home. And then we have her journey to London, like those coming of age stories going back to sort of Dickens. She's making her way to London, having all sorts of dangerous adventures. And it's a really great evocation of the times. You can smell the hairspray, you can taste the warm cider, you can feel the punches, all of that. And it's a lot more nuanced than Richard Allen in terms of stuff like racism. So you've got these youth tribes that are both beguiling and threatening, and there's schisms within them because like there's a male character who was in a skinhead gang, but then some of those have gone off to be like the sort of racist ones. Felicity, stroke Flick, stroke Feathers, she's the kind of person who will confront racists and actually get punched for her pains. So there's that. More satisfying and ultimately a little bit more comforting than the Richard Allen pulp shocker, because the character does go on a journey, and not the literal end of the book, because we end up with a kind of a flashback that tells us kind of the jaw-dropping reason she left the care home in the first place. The end of the narrative, she's floating in the sea and waiting to, what's the rest of her life going to be like? We don't know, because she's got all the possibilities before her. She's kind of owned her own life, really. So I really enjoyed Feathers. That was my week of Dangerous Women. That was also my gangs. Well, between the two, I've ticked off the gangs box on the Garbingo card. That is all. Back soon with something else.